You're in solitary for 23 hours a day. You don't talk to anyone, and if you even start talking to yourself, you get punished for it. They use torture methods no normal person could handle in winter. Capone claimed he was haunted by the ghost of James Clark, one of the victims of the Valentine's Day massacre he ordered. Inmates in his wing said they heard him at night, begging the spirit to leave him alone. Since then, visitors and paranormal investigators say they've run into James Clark's ghost in Capone's old cell. The night Marcus Webb first walked through the iron gate of Eastern State Penitentiary, he made a joke about it. "Feels like a theme park," he said, laughing a little too loud, his voice bouncing off walls that had absorbed 140 years of silence and suffering. His producer, Dana, didn't laugh back. She had done this kind of documentary work long enough to know that certain places don't appreciate humor. She just handed him his audio recorder and walked ahead without a word. Marcus was a true crime journalist from Philadelphia. 34 years old, good at his job, confident in that specific way that people who have never been seriously frightened tend to be. He had covered murders, cults, cold cases. He had walked through crime scenes and interviewed former killers. He believed in evidence, in facts, in things that could be verified. He did not believe in ghosts. That was 2 years ago. He believes now. The assignment had seemed straightforward. A major streaming platform had approached his production company about a long-form documentary on Eastern State Penitentiary, not the Halloween haunted house version, not the paranormal tourism version, but a serious, unflinching examination of what the prison actually was. What it actually did to people. What happened inside those thick stone walls over nearly a century and a half of operation. Marcus jumped at it. He had driven past the prison his entire life. Everyone in Philadelphia had. It sits in the Fairmount neighborhood like something that doesn't belong to the modern world, a massive Gothic structure that looks less like a prison and more like a medieval fortress dropped into the middle of a residential neighborhood. The walls are 30 feet high. The stone is gray and heavy. From the outside, it looks permanent. Immovable. Like a scar on the city that never healed. He started his research the way he always did, with documents. Records. History. Facts. What he found changed his understanding of everything before he even stepped inside for the first time. Eastern State Penitentiary opened its doors in 1829. And here's the thing that people don't understand when they hear that date: this wasn't just a prison opening. This was an experiment. A grand, ambitious, ideological experiment conducted on human beings by people who genuinely believed they were doing something good. The men behind it were Quakers. Philadelphia reformers. Educated, well-intentioned people who looked at the chaos and violence of early American prisons, the overcrowding, the disease, the brutality, and decided they had a better answer. Their answer was solitude. Complete, total, unbroken solitude. The idea was this: if you removed a criminal from all human contact, all noise, all distraction, and placed them alone in a cell with nothing but silence and a Bible, something inside them would shift. They would be forced to confront what they had done. They would feel genuine remorse. They would be reformed. Saved. Made whole again. The word penitentiary itself was invented here. From penitent. From the idea of penance. The place where a person becomes sorry. It sounded almost gentle when you read about it in the original documents. Marcus had read every word of those founding documents, sitting in the archives of the Philadelphia Historical Society, and he could hear the sincerity in the language. These men genuinely believed they were building something merciful. They had no idea what they were actually building. The architecture alone was a statement of intent. The prison was designed by architect John Haviland, and he built it like a wheel. 7 cell blocks extending outward from a central hub, like spokes. From that central hub, a single guard could theoretically observe every corridor simultaneously. It was called the panopticon model, the all-seeing eye. The idea was that a prisoner would never know when they were being watched and when they weren't, so they would have to behave as if they were always being watched. As if God himself were always watching. Each cell was small, about 8 feet wide, 12 feet long. High vaulted ceilings. A single skylight above, called the Eye of God, that let in a narrow shaft of light. A small attached yard where the prisoner could exercise, alone, for 1 hour per day. The rest of the time, the cell. The silence. The walls. When prisoners were moved through the prison, for any reason, they wore hoods over their heads so they could not see the faces of other prisoners. They could not call out. They could not communicate in any way. The guards wore socks over their boots so their footsteps made no sound. The silence was total. The isolation was total. And the human mind, it turns out, was not built for that. Marcus had read the case files. The ones that had survived. And he told me, when I spoke to him later, that reading them was the first moment he started to feel something was wrong, not with the prison as a place, but with what the prison had created inside the men who suffered there. The files were clinical. Detached. Written in the careful handwriting of prison physicians and administrators who were trying very hard not to admit what they were seeing. Prisoner 247, complains of voices. States he can hear whispering through the walls. Examination reveals no other prisoners in adjacent cells. Cause unknown. Prisoner 312, found this morning in a state of extreme agitation. States that someone entered his cell during the night. Door was secured. No evidence of entry. Prisoner 419, ceased speaking entirely. Refuses food. Stares at the wall for hours without moving. No medical cause identified. These were not isolated cases. These were patterns. Repeated, consistent, documented patterns stretching across the first decades of the prison's operation. In 1842, just 13 years after the prison opened, a man named Charles Dickens came to visit. He was already the most famous novelist in the English-speaking world. He came to America on a celebrated tour, and when people asked him what he most wanted to see, he named two things: Niagara Falls, and Eastern State Penitentiary. He walked through the cell blocks. He spoke to prisoners through the thick oak doors. He read the records. He toured the facility with the warden, who was proud of everything he saw. And then Charles Dickens went home and wrote what he had actually witnessed. I believe that very few men are capable of estimating the immense amount of torture and agony which this dreadful punishment, prolonged for years, inflicts upon the sufferers, he wrote. I hold this slow and daily tampering with the mysteries of the brain, to be immeasurably worse than any torture of the body. The warden of Eastern State read those words and was furious. He wrote lengthy rebuttals. He argued that Dickens had misunderstood. That the system was working. That the prisoners were being reformed. But the prison's own records told a different story. Marcus spent 3 weeks in the archives before he ever walked through the front gate. By the time he did, he had read something that he couldn't shake. There was a punishment system at Eastern State that didn't make it into the official histories. Not the formal ones, anyway. You had to dig for it, in physicians' notes, in letters written by guards who later quit, in a handful of accounts from men who had survived the prison and lived to describe it. The punishments weren't supposed to be physical. That was the whole Quaker philosophy: no violence, no corporal punishment, pure isolation as rehabilitation. But as the decades passed and the prison overcrowded and the administrators became less idealistic, the rules bent. There was a punishment called the mad chair. A prisoner who had broken a rule, talked, fought, tried to communicate, would be strapped into a wooden chair with leather restraints on the wrists and ankles. Tightly. 4 days. Unable to move, barely able to breathe deeply. Circulation cut off. Sitting in their own filth. There was something called the iron gag. A device placed in a prisoner's mouth and connected by a chain to their wrists, which were bound behind their back. If the prisoner moved their hands, even slightly, the gag tore the inside of their mouth. In the winter months, there were reports of prisoners being doused with water from the prison's courtyard pump and then chained to the wall of the yard overnight in freezing temperatures. The guards called it the shower bath. There was a hole beneath the prison, carved into the earth, accessed through a trapdoor in one of the cell floors. A chamber barely big enough to stand in, with no light, no air movement, no sound. Prisoners were placed in the hole for weeks at a time. The official name for it in the records was the Klondike. But the prisoners had another name for it. They called it the Dark. And they were terrified of the dark in a way that went beyond ordinary fear. The accounts Marcus found described men who came back from the Klondike changed in ways that couldn't be undone. Men who would not stop whispering. Men who jumped at shadows. Men who refused to close their eyes at night because of what they saw when they did. One account, written by a prison physician in 1887, described a prisoner returned from 14 days in the Klondike. The physician wrote, "The man claims there is something in the dark. When pressed on this claim, he becomes agitated and incoherent. He states, repeatedly, that it is still with him. He states that the dark followed him out." Marcus read that sentence 3 times. The dark followed him out. He told himself it was metaphor. The psychological damage of isolation expressed in language that sounded supernatural but wasn't. He had read enough psychology to know that extreme sensory deprivation produced hallucinations. Produced delusions. Produced a kind of internal reality that felt more real than the external world. He told himself that. He almost believed it. His first night inside the prison was supposed to be a simple location scout. Just him and Dana, walking the cell blocks with flashlights, getting a feel for the space, planning camera angles for the documentary shoot that would begin the following week. The prison was closed to tourists by then. 8 o'clock at night. The last staff members had left by 7:30. The facility manager had given Marcus a key card and the security code and told him to make sure everything was locked when he left. They had been inside for maybe 20 minutes when Dana stopped walking. She stopped in the middle of cell block 4, a long corridor of cells with high arched ceilings, the stone dark and damp smelling, their flashlight beams cutting small circles of yellow light in the dark. She stopped and turned her head slightly to the left, like a person listening to a sound they weren't sure they had actually heard. "Did you hear that?" she said. Marcus had not heard anything. He said so. It was like... She paused. Like someone laughing. But far away. Very far away. They stood still for a moment. The prison was silent. Not the ordinary silence of an empty building, this was something denser. Older. A silence that felt like it had weight. Old buildings, Marcus said. Acoustics. Probably wind coming through one of the broken windows in the upper levels. Dana nodded slowly. But she kept her flashlight pointed toward the far end of the corridor for a long moment before they moved on. They didn't hear anything else that night. But Marcus noticed something before they left. In the beam of his flashlight, near the far end of cell block 4, there was a cell door that was slightly open. Just a few inches. He had a map of the prison and the facility manager had told him which cells were accessible to visitors and which were sealed. This one was supposed to be sealed. He walked to the door and pushed it closed with his palm. The metal was cold. Much colder than the air around it. Unusually cold. He noted it and moved on. He would think about that door many times in the weeks that followed. The history of Cell Block 4 is not something the official tour guides spend a lot of time on. What Marcus discovered in the records is that Cell Block 4 was, for many decades, the location where prisoners with significant psychological deterioration were housed. Men who had broken under the weight of isolation. Men who had lost the ability to function in even the minimal routines of prison life. Men who had become, in the language of the time, disturbed. The prison had no psychiatric ward. It had no mental health treatment of any kind. What it had was Cell Block 4, where the disturbed men were placed together, still in separate cells, still in isolation, but away from the general population. By the prison's own records, more prisoners died in Cell Block 4 than in any other section of the facility. Not from violence, mostly. From what the physicians called exhaustion. From what we would recognize today as the complete collapse of the human mind under conditions it was never meant to endure. One night during his second week of pre-production research, Marcus was alone in the prison. Dana had gone back to the production office to deal with a legal issue about filming permits. He had told her he would stay another hour, take some reference photos, and leave. He was in cell block 6 when his camera battery died. He had a spare in his bag. He started to reach for it when he heard something. Not far away. Not an echo. Close. It came from the cell directly to his left. A low sound. Almost rhythmic. Like someone rocking. Back and forth. The faint creak of something under repetitive weight. He turned his flashlight toward the cell door. It was sealed, locked with a modern padlock in addition to the original iron mechanism. There was a small window, barred, about head height in the door. He leaned forward and looked through it. The cell was empty. Of course it was empty. But the sound continued for another 3 or 4 seconds, and then stopped so abruptly that the silence afterward felt louder than the sound had been. Marcus stood in that corridor for a long moment. Then he changed his battery, took his photos, and left. He didn't tell Dana about it. He told himself there was nothing to tell. Old buildings shifted. Stone contracted and expanded. There were animals, pigeons, rats, that nested in the upper levels. There were 100 explanations. He kept listing them in his head the entire drive home. That's how you know a person is scared, when they can't stop explaining to themselves why they shouldn't be. Let me tell you about Al Capone. Because his story is not what most people think it is. Most people know the basic outline. The most feared gangster in America. The man who ran Chicago's criminal empire in the 1920s. The man responsible for the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, in which his men murdered 7 rival gang members in a garage on February 14, 1929. That massacre was in February. By May of 1929, Capone was in Philadelphia. He had been arrested at a movie theater, of all places, carrying a concealed weapon. He was sentenced to 1 year in Eastern State Penitentiary. His first prison sentence ever. His cell was famous, even at the time. While ordinary prisoners lived in bare stone boxes with wooden furniture and bucket toilets, Capone's cell looked like a living room. Fine furniture. Oriental rugs. Paintings on the walls. A cabinet radio. A proper bed with a real mattress. The warden denied he received special treatment. The Philadelphia newspapers reported otherwise. The photographs told their own story. By all accounts, Capone was comfortable. Well-fed. Well-rested. Protected. And yet, his cell block neighbors, the men in adjacent cells who shared his corridor and could hear everything that happened in his cell, began to notice something within the first few weeks of Capone's stay. At night, Capone screamed. Not screamed the way a person screams in pain. Screamed the way a person screams when they are begging. Pleading. Bargaining with something that wasn't giving them what they asked for. Through the walls, in the hours after midnight, the other prisoners heard the most feared man in America weeping. Sobbing like a child. Saying a name over and over. Jimmy. Jimmy, please. Please just leave. Please. Jimmy Clark. James Clark. One of the 7 men murdered in the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. Shot multiple times in the back of the head in that Chicago garage. One of Capone's kills, ordered by Capone's voice, carried out by Capone's men. In Eastern State Penitentiary, in the carefully furnished cell with the oriental rugs and the cabinet radio, James Clark apparently came to collect. Capone told people about it. He didn't hide it, which might be the strangest part of the story. A man like Capone, a man whose entire survival depended on projecting invulnerability, talked about Jimmy Clark to his lawyer, to his associates, to anyone who came to visit. He wasn't embarrassed by the fear. He was beyond embarrassment. He was just desperate. He said Jimmy stood at the foot of his bed. He said Jimmy looked exactly the way he had looked when he died, suit and all, except the back of his head. He never described the back of Jimmy's head. Maybe he couldn't. He said Jimmy never spoke. He just stood there and looked at him with an expression that Capone could not describe to other people. He said the expression was worse than anything he had ever seen on a living face. Capone left Eastern State after 8 months, early release for good behavior. He left and went to Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. And then to Alcatraz. Jimmy Clark followed him to both. By the time Capone was released from Alcatraz in 1939, he was a broken man. Neurosyphilis, they said. His brain was deteriorating. He was confused, childlike, frightened of things that weren't there. He spent the last years of his life in a mansion in Florida, surrounded by his family, and even there, in the sun and safety of his own home, he could sometimes be heard at night. "Jimmy. Please. Just go." He died in 1947. Whether Jimmy Clark was satisfied by then, history does not record. But that's one story. One ghost. The prison held, over its 142 years of operation, close to 75,000 inmates. Think about that number. 75,000 human beings. Each of them carrying their own suffering into those cells. Each of them broken in their own specific way by the weight of isolation, punishment, and despair. Each of them leaving something behind when they left, or didn't leave. The question isn't whether Eastern State is haunted. The question is how it could possibly not be. Marcus had been conducting interviews for the documentary, with historians, former employees, local researchers, when he first heard about Gary Johnson. Gary Johnson had worked at Eastern State as a locksmith in the mid-1990s, during the early phase of the prison's restoration as a historic site. The building had been abandoned since 1971, when the last prisoners and staff transferred out, and when the city began preservation work in the 1980s, they found a place that had been reclaimed by nature. Vines growing through broken windows. Trees rooting through cracked floors. Birds nesting in the cell blocks. The whole structure collapsing slowly into itself under the weight of 20 years of neglect. Gary Johnson was brought in to assess the ironwork, the locks, the hinges, the doors, the mechanisms that had controlled movement through the prison for over a century. He had been in the building for 3 days before it happened. He was working alone in an upper corridor, repairing a lock on a cell door, when he felt it. He described it to Marcus in very specific terms: not a sound, not a sight, not a temperature change. A sensation. Like something had stepped up directly behind him and was standing so close that he should have been able to feel breath on his neck. Like a presence had pressed itself against his back. He turned around. Nothing. He went back to work. 10 minutes later, he felt it again. Stronger this time. And this time, something happened that he had never been able to explain. His hands stopped working. Not from cold, not from injury, just stopped. Like the signal from his brain to his fingers had been interrupted. He stood there for a moment, hands holding his tools, unable to make his fingers close. Then he heard something in the cell to his left. The cell was locked. Sealed. He hadn't opened it. But from inside it came a sound he described as, like someone dragging their fingers along the inside of the wall. Slow. Like they had nowhere to be. Gary Johnson put down his tools, walked out of the prison, and sat in his truck for 45 minutes before he could drive. He went back the next day. He finished the job. He was a professional. But he told Marcus that every day he worked inside Eastern State, he felt watched. Not in the way you feel watched in a public place. In the way you feel watched when whatever is watching you is not on your side. When Marcus asked him to describe the feeling more precisely, Gary thought about it for a long moment. "You know how sometimes you walk into a room where two people just had a bad fight," he said. "And nobody tells you, but you can feel it? Like the air is still angry?" Marcus said yes. "The whole prison feels like that," Gary said. "All the time. Like something happened there that the building never got over." The most reported paranormal location in the prison, among researchers, visitors, staff, and investigators who have documented their experiences over the past 30 years, is not Capone's cell. It's not the punishment block. It's not the Klondike. It's cell block 12. Cell Block 12 sits at the far end of the prison's main axis. It was one of the last cell blocks added to the facility, constructed in the late 19th century as the prison expanded to handle a growing population. By the time it was built, the original Pennsylvania system of complete isolation had begun to break down. There were too many prisoners. Not enough resources. The silence rules were still official policy but increasingly impossible to enforce. Cell Block 12 became, in the accounts of former prisoners and guards alike, a place where the rules bent most severely. Where the darkness was thicker. Where the sounds were worse. When the prison opened for public tours in the early 1990s, Cell Block 12 began generating reports almost immediately. Visitors heard voices. Not whispers. Voices. Full voices, sometimes. Words that couldn't quite be made out. Conversations happening in cells that had been empty for 20 years. The sounds echoed down the stone corridor and seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Staff members who worked evening tours reported hearing the voices consistently. Not every night. But often enough that they stopped being surprised by it and started being afraid of it in a quiet, settled way, the way you're afraid of something that has always been there and will always be there and there is nothing you can do about it. A paranormal investigation team that spent a night in Cell Block 12 in 2004 recorded something that has never been definitively explained. Their audio equipment captured, at 2:14 a.m., a sound that lasted approximately 8 seconds. When cleaned and enhanced, it resolved into what appeared to be a human voice saying 4 words. "Don't leave me here." The team's lead investigator spent months trying to debunk it. External sound sources. Equipment malfunction. Reflections of their own speech recorded on a delay. She couldn't find an explanation that held up. The recording still exists. You can find it online. And the thing that gets people, the thing that the hair-raising reviewers always mention, is not the content of the words. It's the tone. It doesn't sound angry. It doesn't sound threatening. It sounds, in the most precise use of the word, desperate. It sounds like something that has been asking not to be left there for a very long time, and knows that no one is going to answer. Marcus was in Cell Block 12 alone when the door closed. He had been there for maybe 10 minutes, recording ambient sound for the documentary. Dana was in the central hub, running cable. The prison was technically closed and empty except for the two of them. He had his back to the cell block door, the heavy iron door at the far end of the corridor that separated Cell Block 12 from the rest of the prison. He was facing the row of cells, recording. The door behind him closed. Not swung. Not drifted. Closed, with the definitive sound of iron meeting iron. The specific sound of a door that has been pushed. He turned around. The door was shut. He walked back to it and tried the handle. It opened easily from the inside. He looked out into the connecting passage. Empty. No breeze. No movement. He stood in the doorway for a moment, thinking about what could have caused a heavy iron door to swing closed with enough force to make that sound, in a building with no significant air movement that he couldn't come up with a good answer. He went back to recording. 2 minutes later, something touched the back of his neck. Not grabbed. Not struck. Touched. The lightest possible contact, the way you might touch someone's shoulder to get their attention. Marcus turned around so fast he nearly dropped the recorder. The corridor behind him was empty. He stood very still. His heart was doing something unpleasant in his chest. The corridor stretched away from him in both directions. Stone walls, sealed cell doors, the dim overhead lights casting their flat institutional glow. Nothing moved. But the air felt wrong. He had been in the prison enough by then to know the baseline feeling of the place. And the air in Cell Block 12 right now felt the way Gary Johnson had described, angry. Charged. Like something had happened very recently and the walls hadn't processed it yet. He said out loud, feeling slightly ridiculous, "I'm not going to hurt anything. I'm just here to tell the story." He doesn't know why he said that. But afterward, the feeling changed. Not disappeared. Changed. Like whatever was paying attention to him had decided, for the moment, to let him be. He finished his recording and left. He didn't tell Dana about it until 3 days later. When he finally did, she listened to everything he said without interrupting. Then she was quiet for a moment. "I know," she said. "You know? Something touched me in cell block 6, she said. "The second night we were here. I didn't tell you because I didn't want to deal with your whole rational explanation thing." They sat with that for a moment. "Are we still doing the documentary?" Marcus asked. "Obviously," Dana said. "The thing about Eastern State Penitentiary that the ghost hunters and the paranormal documentaries tend to gloss over is this: the horror of the place was not supernatural in origin. The horror was built deliberately. By human beings. With human hands. With good intentions, which is almost the worst part. Think about what the Pennsylvania system actually created, mechanically, in the human mind. Take a person. Put them in a stone room 8 feet wide. Give them 1 hour of exercise per day in a private yard where they cannot see another human being. Forbid them from speaking. Forbid all human contact except the minimal exchanges required for food delivery and medical inspection. Do this for years. Sometimes for decades. Psychiatry didn't exist as a formal discipline when Eastern State was founded. The understanding of what isolation does to the human mind, the documented, studied, measured understanding, didn't exist. But even without the science, people knew. The guards who worked the cell blocks knew. The physicians who wrote those careful clinical notes knew. Charles Dickens knew, after 2 hours in the building. The mind, deprived of input, generates its own. It has to. It cannot function in a vacuum. So it starts producing sounds, presences, faces, voices, companions. The hallucinations of solitary confinement are extraordinarily specific and consistent across cultures and time periods. Prisoners report the same things. Figures in the corner of the cell. Voices from the walls. The sense of a presence that is not hostile but deeply, essentially sad. The sense of being watched by something that has been watching for a long time. Now, here is the question that Marcus found himself sitting with in the weeks he spent inside Eastern State. If 75,000 men experienced those hallucinations in those cells, if 75,000 human minds generated those presences, those voices, those figures, did those creations go away when the men were released? When the prison closed? When the last guard walked out and locked the gate in 1971? Or did they stay, a place that has absorbed that much concentrated human suffering over that many decades, stone walls that have held the psychic residue of 10,000 broken minds? Does that place just go back to being regular stone? Does the suffering leave when the people leave? The investigators who have spent time inside Eastern State consistently report the same thing: the prison does not feel empty. It feels full. Not of people, but of something that people left behind. Something that the stone absorbed over 142 years and has not released. Marcus came to believe that the question of whether Eastern State is really haunted, in the strict, literal, theological sense, is the wrong question. The right question is, what is a haunting? If a place has absorbed so much human suffering that it communicates that suffering to every person who enters it, if the walls have soaked up enough pain that you can feel it when you press your hand against the stone, is that not a haunting? Does it matter whether the thing doing the haunting is a supernatural spirit or the accumulated weight of documented human atrocity? Marcus didn't have an answer to that. He still doesn't. Let me tell you about the last night. This was near the end of production. Most of the documentary filming was done. They had one final overnight shoot scheduled: atmospheric footage, cell block 12, the central hub, the punishment cells. Just Marcus and Dana and a 2-person camera crew. The crew, a cameraman named Pete and his assistant, a young woman named Alicia on her first major documentary shoot, had been briefed on the location. They knew the history. They knew the paranormal reputation. Pete was a skeptic, like Marcus had been. Alicia was less certain. They went in at 9 p.m. By midnight, Pete had stopped making jokes. The first hour was fine, professional, Focused, they moved through the cell blocks with the calm efficiency of experienced filmmakers, capturing what they needed. Marcus noticed that Alicia kept glancing at doorways. Kept looking slightly past the thing she was supposed to be looking at, like she was checking her peripheral vision. At around 11, something happened to the camera. Not a malfunction. Not a dead battery. The camera continued running, the record light was on, the time code was advancing, every indicator said the camera was working perfectly. But when Pete reviewed the footage later, 8 minutes of material from cell block 4 was simply black. Not corrupted. Not damaged. Just black. As if the camera had recorded pure darkness for 8 minutes in a cell block with operational overhead lighting. Pete checked the camera extensively. Found nothing wrong with it. Could not explain the footage. But that was later. In the moment, they didn't know about it yet. What happened in the moment was in cell block 12, at approximately 12:20 in the morning. They were filming the corridor. Pete had the camera, Alicia was handling sound, Dana was directing from behind. Marcus was slightly ahead, walking slowly down the center of the corridor while Dana guided his movements. He stopped. The others nearly walked into him. At the far end of the corridor, at the sealed iron door that Marcus had watched close by itself weeks earlier, there was a figure. Not a shadow. Not a trick of light. A figure. Standing in front of the door, facing them. It was there for approximately 4 seconds. Then it wasn't. All 4 of them saw it. They each described it separately, later, before comparing notes, and their descriptions matched in every significant detail. The figure was male. It was standing very still. It appeared to be wearing the type of clothing, rough, institutional, that would be consistent with the prison's early period of operation. And its posture, each of them said independently, was not threatening. It was waiting. That was the word all 4 of them used. Waiting. Like someone standing in a line, or outside a door, or at a bus stop, with the patient, resigned quality of a person who has been waiting for a long time and has stopped expecting the wait to end soon. The 4 of them stood in the corridor for a moment. Silent. Then Dana said, very quietly, "Did everyone see that?" 3 voices said yes. They finished the shoot. They are professionals. But Marcus told me, when we spoke about it, that the last 40 minutes in the prison felt completely different from everything before. The playful skepticism, the comfortable distance of documentary filmmaking, all of that was gone. What replaced it wasn't terror, exactly. It was something more like recognition. It felt like we'd been seen, he said. Like whatever was in that building had been tolerating us for weeks, letting us walk around and take our pictures and do our interviews, and that night it decided to let us know it knew we were there. Not a threat. Not even particularly unfriendly. Just, you should know. We're still here. Eastern State Penitentiary closed in 1971. Today it is a museum and a historic site. Hundreds of thousands of people walk through its corridors every year. They take photographs. They read the interpretive panels. Some of them go on evening tours and some of them book the Halloween experience, and some of them, the serious ones, come with their recording equipment and their EMF meters and their infrared cameras, looking for evidence. Most of them feel something. Whether what they feel is genuine paranormal phenomenon, or the deep psychological impact of a place designed to break the human mind, or the simple weight of documented historical atrocity, is a question you'll have to decide for yourself. But here is the last thing I'll leave you with. The prison's own records, the official historical documents, housed in the archives, available to researchers, include a notation about the day the last prisoner left Eastern State in 1971. A routine administrative note in the log maintained by the duty officer. It records the transfer of the final inmates to Graterford Prison, the locking of the facility, the departure of staff. Standard procedure. The note is mundane in every way. Except for one line. At the very bottom of the entry, in handwriting that is slightly different from the rest, as if it was added later, as an afterthought, or maybe as a warning, someone wrote. The building is now empty. And then, beneath that, in the same hand, underlined twice. Or so we assume. No name. No date addendum. No explanation. It was written by someone who had spent time inside those walls. Someone who knew what the stone had absorbed. Someone who had heard the sounds in cell block 12 or felt the presence in cell block 4 or seen something standing at a door that should have been empty. Someone who understood that a place like Eastern State Penitentiary doesn't empty. It just gets quieter. And the things that are still there, the things that the cells and the corridors and the dark underground chambers have held for 142 years, they wait. Patient as stone. Patient as darkness. Still waiting for someone to finally open the door and let them out. The walls of Eastern State Penitentiary are 30 feet high and 3 feet thick. They were built to keep things in. They still are.